the radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome. Welcome to Yaron Brook Show. It's Sunday afternoon. Hope you enjoyed yesterday's show. We talked about Socialism Sucks with the author of Socialism Sucks, so one of the co-authors of Socialism Sucks, and Robert Lawson, and his co-author is Ben Powell. I hope some of you at least went out and bought the book and enjoying and will enjoy reading it. All right, today, two topics on the table from my perspective. I'm sure there'll be some others on the super chat, but two topics. One is some more thoughts on the UK elections. I mean, I was probably a little too pleased. So, worth revisiting, worth rethinking. I'm still happy by Corbyn's loss, but lessons. Let's think about what the future holds in terms of the UK and what this suggests for the way or the future of the right more generally. And then I want to talk about Donald Trump's anti-Semitism executive order and the ruckus that has created. There's a lot of angst that has been caused by that on both left and right. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about maybe anti-Semitism more broadly. And there's a nice connection there from the British elections to anti-Semitism. And that goes through Jeremy Corbyn and generally the anti-Semitism on the left in Great Britain of the Labour Party. All right, so let's talk first about the British elections. So first, I think the defeat of Jeremy Corbyn is significant. It's meaningful. I think it is a rejection to a large extent of his socialist agenda, of his idea of nationalizing everything, of pouring huge quantities of money into new programs, new projects, and a massive expansion of the government. I think all of that, clearly was rejected in this election, kind of the Jeremy Corbyn nutty leftism. And I think the fact that he was shown to be anti-Semitic and that the anti-Semitism came out and was clear-cut and that, English Jews who are typically quite left, just like their American counterparts, refused to vote for the Labour Party for exactly this reason. But there's more going on here, and I think it's important to point this out. I pointed out some of this in when I talked last time, but I want to emphasize it more. Before we get to that, I want to make want to cover one other issue. I noticed on some of the commentary, on some of the comments on the show, people said, well, if you're happy with Boris Johnson's winning, why weren't you happy with Donald Trump winning? And there are two reasons why my response is not the same. Well, three reasons. Reason number one is Jeremy Corbyn. Reason number two is Donald Trump. Reason number three is the different political systems that exist between the two countries. So I just saw Libby Molad join the thing on Facebook. She's the only friend I have who is a politician. Libby, are you a politician now? Is that true? Libby is running in a new political party in Israel in the Israeli elections in a few weeks, early next year sometime, in March, I think. So in a reformed new liberal party that is shrugged off its religious associations and now is really a free market liberal political party. So cool. I'm behind Libby 100%. All right. That was funny. We're talking about politics. So those are the three reasons why I think it's different, why the victory of Donald Trump is different than Boris Johnson. Again, Corbyn versus Hillary, Trump versus Johnson, and the American system and the British system are different. So one, I think Corbyn is much, much worse, and I said this, than anybody on the left in the United States, with maybe the exception of somebody like Bernie Sanders. But Bernie Sanders isn't running and hasn't been running, and I don't think will be the guy who ultimately faces Donald Trump. But I also have said in the past that I think even if Bernie Sanders wins, he couldn't do anything. And that relates to point 3, which I'll get to, which is the difference in political systems. Second, I do not think Boris Johnson is a Donald Trump. I don't think he's good. I'm very critical of Boris Johnson, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. But he is a pragmatist. In many respects, he is similar to Trump in his pragmatism and in some of his views, or some of the views he panders to. And I'll get to those in a little bit. So I'll talk about all the negatives about Boris Johnson in a minute. But character-wise, communication-wise, the kind of what he projects is completely different. And I think a lot of what is so horrible about Trump is not just his ideas. I could even imagine supporting somebody who had some of his ideas, but was a human being, was a decent human being. I think that makes a big difference when you're the president or the prime minister. So that's number 2, and I'm not going to get into a comparison between the two because I don't think it's helpful at this point. You know what I think of Trump. But the number 3 is really important, and that is the difference between political systems. In the United States, the president, in many respects, has a lot less power than the prime minister in England, because when a prime minister wins, it also means his political party has won. And what that means is that the political party now controls the equivalent of the House of Representatives and the Senate. So by voting, or if Jeremy Corbyn would have won, not only would he become prime minister, the executive branch, but he would have also dominated the legislative branch. Therefore, he would have been able to succeed in everything that he does. And a political leader like Jeremy Corbyn or Johnson have a lot more power in the UK, in a parliamentary system, in shaping their political party. So Corbyn has shaped the Labour Party in his own image in a way that for a Republican or a Democrat would be almost impossible to do in the American political system, because of the way the British system works and the way party politics in Britain works. And the same thing, by the way, is true in Israel and in most parliamentary systems. So in the United States, even though you might win as president, and even if your political party wins the House and Senate, you still will get opposition within your party that is significant and substantial. There's going to be a lot less of that in a parliamentary system. Parliamentary systems get more stuff done, legislation-wise, because of this. Because the executive branch, the legislature branch are much more integrated. The founding fathers of America understood that to minimize the possibility of the government violating individual rights, we wanted to make it hard for the different parts of governments to work together. Indeed, we wanted to create a checks and balances system where they balanced each other out, and more importantly, they checked each other, so that it isn't easy to get stuff done in America. For example, you need 60 votes in the Senate to get anything substantial done. It's rare that one political party has 60 votes. Now, that would be unheard of in Great Britain. Here you need both houses. Now, yes, in the UK they have the House of Lords, but it's not meaningful, the House of Lords, in terms of legislation. So Jeremy Corbyn winning gives the Labour Party much more power than even a Bernie Sanders winning, as bad as that would be. And in that sense, a victory for Jeremy Corbyn is a lot worse than a victory for anybody in the United States and the Democratic Party. Certainly, he is much, much worse than Hillary Clinton or kind of a middle of the road, nothing on the American left. So that's point number one. That's why I don't see the similarities. Even if you go beyond, even if you think that Johnson is the same as Donald Trump, there's a big difference in terms of what the meaning of a victory of the left in the UK would have vis-a-vis, in terms of political power as compared to in the United States. Okay, now let's talk more about Johnson. So forget Jeremy Corbyn, forget the left. Let's talk about what Johnson's, how he won, and what I expect moving forward. Now, I've often said that Brexit is either good or bad, depending on what they do with it. Brexit is just, in a sense, the United Kingdom gaining some more ability to dictate their own future, independent of what happens in the rest of Europe. And they could determine a pretty bad future, or they could determine a good future. So Brexit will be judged based on what they do with it. And what one believes they will do with it depends on why you think Brexit was so popular. And in this election, indeed, it seems that Brexit is even more popular than it was when the referendum was actually passed. Because if you think about it, not only did Labour, who were ambiguous about Brexit, lose big time, including in their stronghold in the industrial north, but the Liberal Democrats, who were the only political party that were explicitly anti-Brexit, who should have garnered all their Remain votes, and therefore should have grown, and I would have expected the Liberal Democrats to grow at the expense of Labour, maybe even at the expense of the Conservatives to some extent. The Liberal Democrats were crushed. I mean, they weren't crushed, but in comparison to expectations, they were crushed. They lost seats, and indeed the leader of the Liberal Democrats lost her seat. Now, it's interesting to observe why. Well, one is because I think support for Remain has actually dwindled over time in the UK. And at the end of the day, focused on the Labour Party, even though the Labour Party was not an ambiguously pro-Remain. It was quite the contrary. They were strongly flirting with leave because their voters want to leave. Second, the Liberal Democrats adopted the cultural nuttiness of the left. So one of the things that killed the leader of the Liberal Democrats, and I forget her name now, was a video released showing her talking about, kind of this what it means to be a woman. Is there such a thing as a woman? Transgender stuff, which I guess alienated a lot of kind of what I call ordinary, common people who might have been Remain, but are not going to adopt this culturally, I don't know what the term is, this culturally leftist agenda. So the two things that I think alienated people from the labor movement and from the Liberal Democrats in the end. One is kind of the overreaching when it comes to socialism, overreaching when it comes to the role of the state in economics. Not that they oppose the role of the state in economics, but the labor just went overboard on that. Second, the idea, actually there are more than two, the idea of Remain, the idea of remaining. I think a lot of the labor's traditional supporters were against remaining and for leaving. And Remain is associated with elites, with globalization, with free trade, with free movement of capital, and maybe most importantly with free immigration, or freer immigration, movement of labor. And third, I think the kind of the wackiness of 99 different genders and the whole left's obsession about white guilt and obsession about racial politics and gender politics and all of that stuff, which I think most people just don't get, don't care about, think is nutty and think is crazy. And I think those are the three things that turned voters against both the Liberal Democrats and Boris Johnson. Now, what did Boris Johnson do in order to both capture those voters and realign the conservative movement? Because I think he has realigned the conservative. This is not, unfortunately, in spite of what I said last time where I was trying to be a little optimistic, this is far from the Margaret Thatcher conservative movement of 30, 40 years ago. What Johnson has realigned the movement around is a left-leaning economic policy, an economic policy of government intervention, government control. I mean, one of the things that he kept emphasizing in the campaign is that he was going to dramatically increase spending on the National Health Service, that he was no longer going to abide by so-called austerity measures. There hasn't been austerity in the UK. It's ridiculous. But on any kind of controls on government spending, he's going to spend. He emphasizes he's going to spend on infrastructure. He's going to spend on health care. He's going to spend on welfare, on expanding the state and expanding the power of the state and the state's involvement, particularly on the side of welfare and helping the poor. Indeed, you can expect tax cut from the Johnson government, but there'll be all tax cuts aimed at the working class, the poorer, parts of society. So Johnson has moved the Conservative Party significantly to the left on economic policy, at least in the agenda he presented that won him the election. And I think since he's going to want to win again, I think he's going to want to rule in order to win. I think the conclusion is, and if you look at Donald Trump, I think the conclusion is, if you are on the right, that the way to win elections from the right is to figure out the ways in which your voters feel left out of the economy, feel hurt by the economy, feel alienated by the current economy, and address those. And that means things like being, anti-trade. And I said before, I really hope that the UK becomes this free trade island like it was in the 19th century. But I fear that's not going to happen because I fear there's a huge motivation to be anti-trade if you want to win elections. To be pro-welfare state, to be pro-socialized medicine, to be pro-government spending, not to be pro-austerity, to be for an infrastructure project. Infrastructure spending. You see this with Donald Trump. You see it with a massive government spending that is going on right now. The huge deficits that the United States is engaged in. And I think you're going to see the same thing with Jeremy Corbyn. I think he's going to move economically to the left, not to the left of Jeremy Corbyn, not to the left of Bernie Sanders, but to the left of Thatcher, to the left of even the last few conservative governments that have been pretty weak and pretty pathetic. Just like Trump has moved to the left of George Bush, who already had moved the Republican Party far to the left on economic policies. So one, you're going to see a conservative party that is going to move to the left on economics. and a Conservative Party that's going to move to the right. And here I use right and left in kind of the conventional way, not to mean individualism, collectivism, individualism on the right, collective. No, both are collectivist, but right to mean more nationalist, more fascist, more xenophobic. He's going to move to the right on many of the social issues. So you can expect Johnson to be far more efficient than Donald Trump on restricting immigration, significantly restricting immigration. Again, Boris has a much stronger, much more capacity to bring about new legislation than Donald Trump has. So Trump has proposed new immigration legislation, but it goes nowhere because he needs some Democratic support, and he needs a significant Democratic support in the House of Representatives. So I think he's going to move to the right on immigration. Greg Salamiri asked in economics, will Johnson be to the right, left or right of Cameron? I think he's going to be to the left of Cameron. I think there are going to be people in his government who are to the right of Cameron. There are actually quite a few free marketers who are part of the government, but I think Johnson's political instincts are going to drive him to the left. I think he's going to be strongly left on the environmentalism. He's going to put together some kind of Green New Deal, not the nutty Green New Deal that we have in the U.S., so a more reasonable Green New Deal, but reasonable and Green New Deal don't go together in the same sentence. I think he's going to, again, cut taxes on middle class and working class. I think he is going to increase welfare spending and increase spending on the NHS. So he's going to be cutting government spending and increase government spending more than Cameron did. Then, again, I think that people in the government that will be against that, and it'll be interesting to see the dynamic within the Conservative Party on how this all works out. But given that he won, given that he's got this mandate, I think things will be dictated by Jeremy Corbyn. I think Jeremy Corbyn has some very good political instincts, and he knows what wins. Again, what wins, we now have a formula, I think. You can take Donald Trump, and you can take Johnson, and you can now establish a formula for the right to win. And if you're interested in this, I think articulated really, really well, Andrew Sullivan, who's, by the way, sympathetic to this formula. Andrew Sullivan, who writes for New York Magazine, who's kind of a Catholic conservative, sometimes libertarian, probably not anymore, not free market anymore, but doesn't know where he quite belongs, anti-Trump, really, really good writer. I'm actually doing an event with Andrew Sullivan in March at Clemson University, so it'll be me and Andrew Sullivan discussing Western civilization on stage. Should be really interesting. I'm looking forward to that. But Andrew Sullivan writes, this is the new formula for the right to win. 1, left on politics. 2, right on immigration. Be more restrictive on immigration. And again, I think Andrew's right in the sense that Trump has not been effective on immigration, has not been able to restrict immigration because he doesn't have the legislative power to do so. I expect Boris Johnson to be much more effective in restricting immigration in the UK. 3, to be much more nationalistic in rhetoric, in verbiage, and there is a positive element here. I hate to say that, but there's a positive element and a negative element. And the negative, I think, way overpowers the positive. The positive element is, for a long time, certainly since 9/11, I have been complaining, and many of us have been complaining, that the biggest problem in the West is its lack of understanding of what Western civilization is. Its lack of willingness to defend Western civilization. Its lack, if you will, of a self-esteem and a backbone. It's standing up for what Western civilization really is. And in defending certain principles that are Western principles. So I think there's an element of Boris Johnson and the Conservatives in the UK that has a little bit of that. But here's the problem, and this is the problem with the right in Europe generally. the right that is more assertive, more strong. We have a culture. We have a good culture. We will not succumb our culture. We will not give in to Islam or to anybody in giving up our culture. Western culture is great. Is that they don't know what it is. They don't understand what civilization, Western civilization, is. So they mouth it off, but they can't actually defend what the culture is. And, I saw that in my debates with, not debates, discussions/debates with, this is where my mind goes blank. What's his name? The British scholar who wrote about immigration, Douglas Murray. So in my discussions with Douglas Murray, you could tell that while he was struggling constantly to articulate what Western civilization was. He got some of it right. The great art is Western civilization, but he couldn't detach it from Christianity. He couldn't articulate it in a clear way. I mean, I've often said over and over again that Western civilization is basically two ideas that are reflected in the art, are reflected in all the different achievements in the science and in the achievements of Western civilization. But the two ideas are reason and individualism, the efficacy of reason and what that means in terms of individualism, and therefore political freedom and capitalism. That is what Western civilization is, as manifest in the kind of individualistic art, the kind of expressive art, the kind of romantic art, but even in the Renaissance, the kind of individualistic, expressive, science-based, observation-based, you could say reason-based art that comes out of the Renaissance. And a respect for the individual and heroism that, again, comes out of the Renaissance, which is all about this reason and individualism. It's what they get from Greece. And that's what Western civilization is. It's those ideas that they adopt from Greece. They don't know that. They have no concept of what it is. So when they talk about Western civilization, it comes out this babbling, incoherent nonsense. And much of it can easily be viewed as xenophobic, even racist, and incoherent mostly. And of course, into that space of incoherence, what you get are the worst elements of the right jumping in to explain, to articulate exactly what Western civilization is. And they are, without exception, they are racists. And soon I'm going to be doing a show on the new alt-right. I've just, thanks to Bradley Thompson, Professor Bradley Thompson, I've discovered a whole new wing, if you will, of the right, of the alt-right, that is quite fascinating. And we'll be talking about that and talking about the response of conventional conservatives to them and how this plays into the civil war within the conservative movement between traditional conservatives and the national conservatives. But in my view, the national conservatives are winning, and that's exactly what Boris Johnson, even though he is not a national conservative, he is not, I think to the extent that he has any beliefs, I think he's a complete pragmatist. I don't think he's a national conservative. But I think that is the winning formula. The winning formula today on the right is national conservatism, industrial policy, trade policy, immigration policy, more government intervention in the economy, and more rah-rah-rah about the flag and about the greatness of the nation. All at the same time, spending like crazy. Because what national conservatives have done is they've adopted the talking point of the left that says capitalism doesn't work for the middle class, capitalism, economic freedom doesn't work for the poor, and inequality is outrageous and ridiculous, and we need to help the middle class, and we need to help them by this industrial policy, trade policy, immigration policy. It's all meant to help you. Again, implicit in there, because they can't define what they're doing, and because they can't define the defense of Western civilization, implicit is there is a huge opening for the much worse elements within the right to flood in. And we'll be talking a lot about this over the days, weeks, months, years, because I'm viewing myself more and more as one of the few voices out there that is urging us to be cautious of where, of where this country's heading and who we're handing this country over to in terms of who's going to step in ultimately to fill in all these voids that are being created. And we're seeing it. All right, so, Greg actually says he's... So if you look today, if you look today at the left and the right as compared to the 1980s, right? There was a revolution that happened in the late 1970s in the West, and ultimately throughout the world. There's a real intellectual revolution, which I think Ayn Rand had a lot to do with. The intellectual revolution was manifest in the election ultimately of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and in the fall of the Berlin Wall, and beyond that, the Asian tigers, the changes in Asia, the real changed attitude towards free markets. In the late 1970s, there was, because I think of Ayn Rand, because of Milton Friedman, because of Mises, Hayek, and many others who would not typically would want to put them in the same umbrella, and as a consequence of putting them in the cell better, you get a lot of conflicts, and this is why it didn't last. A certain recognition about the failure of statism, the failure of socialism, the failure of nationalism, and a recognition that the solution was freedom, to some extent, economic freedom. A freeing up of one's own economies, a freeing up of international markets, an increase in global trade, the virtues and values of trade. And you saw the spread very, very quickly around the world. And Thatcher was probably more important for this than even Reagan, because for much of the world, she was more radical. She spoke about these economic issues in a more radical way. And everybody knew kind of America was already capitalist, or at least in their mind it was capitalist. We know better, but in their mind it was capitalist. But England had not. England had been socialist, and it had turned capitalist, and the rest of the world looked at that and said, wow, we can do that too. And it wasn't just at the political level. There were real rise in new intellectuals who believed that, that as Huntington said with the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was the end of history. Basically, what had won, in his view, was this liberal, pro-markets, mixed economy. And everybody basically embraced it, left and right. So that in the 1990s, the Democratic Party gave us a Bill Clinton who wasn't particularly leftist, who one plan about, Hillary care of nationalizing health care or changing healthcare, when that failed, and it failed pretty quickly, basically became a middle-of-the-road, standard kind of politician who actually did some things that the conservatives cheered, like welfare reform. Didn't do anything particularly leftist while he was there. What he destroyed in terms of the presidency was character. Right, and I think he is in a long chain that leads us to Donald Trump. But yeah, his demagoguery and his character, what demeaned the presidency. But in terms of policy, he did nothing too offensive. And in the United Kingdom, even when Thatcher was gone, the left gave us a Tony Blair, who took out of the Labour manifesto, of the Labour Party's manifesto, kind of the remnants of Marxism, and made it much more of a centrist party, which on economic issues was fairly sympathetic to the markets. And the UK flourished during those years, and indeed the financial centers flourished and did very, very well. And to a large extent, up until the financial crisis, both left and right globally, had moved to the center, had moved to kind of mixed economy tilted towards markets like the Scandinavian system, which is tilted towards markets with big welfare states. And there was a debate about how big the welfare state should be. The left wanted a big one, the right wanted a smaller one, but generally everybody wanted a welfare state. And the right, when in power, usually expanded the welfare state on their own, just like George Bush did with Part D of Medicare. But while giving lip service to capitalism and free markets and so on. And that was true of the left. They would increase regulations a bit and they would give lip service to more welfare, but they wouldn't do anything dramatic, like Bill Clinton's welfare reform actually moved away from welfare. There was this equilibrium state where you had a mixed economy and everybody was happy with the mixed economy, and the history had ended because the big conflict between a mixed economy and socialism had ended. Socialism had lost, the mixed economy had won, and we were in for, and China adopted this, and all the Asian tigers adopted this, and much of the world was adopting this, and Eastern Europe was adopting it, and some struggling with it. But there was this recognition that that was the new status quo. And then I think the financial crisis happened. And I think historians will emphasize the importance of the financial crisis because it was a dramatic turn, in spite of the Tea Party, it was a dramatic turn in global opinion away and against capitalism, and away and against freedom, and away and against markets. Everywhere. Suddenly in Europe and the United States, both left and right became critics of the market. I mean, you should listen to a moderate Republican right now, Rubio. I mean, Rubio has gone nutty left on us in terms of economic policy. Not only does he want the massive expansion of the welfare state, but he argues for industrial policy. And he's trying to shy away from the conservative nationalism. So he's positioning himself as a moderate, centrist Republican. But he's adopting the anti-capitalism, anti-freedom, anti-economic freedom perspective. Because that's what people want. We get the politicians we deserve. So there is today a massive movement on left and right away from free markets. So the left has become way left. So the response to the financial crisis in England and the UK was ultimately Labour going with Jeremy Corbyn. The response to the financial crisis in the US was first, all right, let's be somewhat moderate. And I know some of you think this is ridiculous, but Obama was moderate. I mean, he didn't give us Medicare for all. He didn't even argue for it. And if you look at all of the things that he did, he didn't move us way to the left. Certainly not after the first 2 years. The big two things that Obama did was Dodd-Frank, which was supported by many Republicans. And if McCain had won, he would have passed a version of Dodd-Frank. And he gave us Obamacare. I mean, two big ones, granted. But then he didn't do anything really. Indeed, government spending went down as a percentage of GDP during his second term in office. And the Economic Freedom Index in the United States went up significantly, dramatically during his second term in office. So first, we elected a relative moderate. And then the party shifted dramatically to the left. Not all at once, because first we had to go through the Hillary Clinton thing. But one of the reasons Hillary Clinton couldn't win or didn't win is because she was too much of that old school mixed economy, pro-markets enough that you caused the financial crisis and will not accept that anymore. And one of the things about Trump was that he was refreshing to people, some people, because he blamed the elites for the financial crisis. He blamed, and he was going to clean the swamp. He was going to get rid of all those people who brought us that financial crisis. So here we have a shift dramatically leftwards. I think you're seeing it in the election, this cycle, with the Democrats, you know, the Elizabeth Warrens, the AOCs, the Bernie Sanders. Look at Bernie Sanders, how successful he was against Hillary Clinton. I mean, it was amazing how successful he was, particularly among young people who grew up in, you know, during the financial crisis and the post-financial crisis. And at the same time, what you saw is a shift in the Republican Party away from free markets, because they don't want to be held responsible for the financial crisis and everything involved. And towards more government involvement. Away from globalization. Again, the mantra of the 80s and 90s, the beauties of globalization, which I think are all true. And to now more an isolationist. An isolationist I don't mean here not being the policeman of the world. I'm all for not being the policeman of the world. That's not isolationism. That's a truly, you know, what we need is a truly egoistic foreign policy where we get involved only when our real interests, and the interests of our government, that is in protecting individual rights, are involved. But when they do, we should definitely intervene when they are being threatened. But we're getting to a point of building walls here, building walls in the UK. I think you'll see that. You'll see very restrictive immigration policies in the UK. I think we're at the point of building trade walls. As much as I'd love to believe Boris Johnson is going to sign all these free trade deals with the world, I don't think the United States would allow him to sign a free trade deal with the United States, because the United States doesn't believe in free trade. So, you know, and you know, again, is Boris Johnson, I mean, I said this in England and people looked at me a little. I mean, one of the great things the UK could do is lower tariffs with the rest of the world. For example, Africa, if you really want to help Africa, all the people out there who care about Africa, Bill Gates and all the rest of them, one of the things you could really help Africa, particularly Europeans, one of the best, the best way you can help Africa right now, from an economic perspective, is lower tariffs to zero on African agricultural product. And you'd create a massive inflow of good, because food is, I mean, Africa is incredibly fertile. There's huge amounts. They can produce enormous amounts of food. They can do so cheaply, and the seasons are different. You can import all year round. And it would be a huge, huge benefit to Africa. And yet, no European country is going to do that. And certainly not Boris Johnson's England is going to do that, because one of the places Boris Johnson won is in the farmlands. Farmers love Boris Johnson. So he's not going to create competition for them. So you're not going to see a reduction in tariffs on food from Africa. And the same is true with the industry. Where did he win? He won in the industrial north. He won in labor country, Manchester and Liverpool and places like that where industry is big. He's not going to upset them by having a free trade agreement with China, who can compete with that industry, or for that matter, a free trade with Europe. So I am very skeptical about what is going to happen in the UK right now. And I know a lot of free market friends who are in the UK who are very optimistic and rah-rah and very positive, and I hope they're right. But I think what we're seeing is the winning formula of the right being basically economic and cultural nationalism. Economic and cultural nationalism. That's where the population is. That's what people want. And it's a rejection of the intellectual elite, because the intellectual elite is worth rejecting, because the intellectual elite are crazy leftists who have gobbled together, a bunch of things, including globalization and 99 genders. And, yes, also the welfare system, and everybody's adopting the welfare system, but the part of the globalization and the part of the benefits of immigration and the parts of what did I just say? Of the 99 genders, that is being tossed into the water. There are no voices, no dominant voices, no prominent voices arguing for individualism. None. And this is what we're left with. We're left with a right that is going to be protectionist, anti-immigration, pro-welfare, pro-regulation of big business, breakup of banks, breakup of tech companies, and so on. And that's the winning formula for the right. Oh, and by the way, I think the winning formula for the right will ultimately also include environmental regulations against global warming. I don't think that's come to America yet, but I think it will. I think it will, because that's where young people are. And if you want the young people's vote, you're going to have to acknowledge that global warming supposedly is a real thing and we have to do something about it. That's the politically winning formula. If you want to win politically in the short run, that's the formula. That's the formula. Maybe in America it doesn't include the climate change, but certainly in Europe it does. And you will see that mimicked now throughout the right everywhere. It's the death of pro-globalization, pro-free market, pro-free trade, pro-freedom on the political right. I think that's the death of it. Now, I could be proven wrong if Boris Johnson rules differently than he actually spoke. But I don't see it. Or if the Republican Party in the U.S. ultimately rejects Trumpism and adopts a candidate that's more free market. I'm not sure who that would be. But I don't see that. I see Trumpism and the conservative movement in the UK and the right generally throughout Europe moving in that direction. By the way, this idea that the financial crisis was a pivot point was not just a pivot point in the West. It was also a pivot point in China. So China pivoted after the financial crisis. They did a massive government stimulus and turned away slowly over time as they decided and concluded that the financial crisis was caused by capitalism. They moved away from liberalizing their markets and moved more and more towards more authoritarianism and more involvement in markets, more industrial planning, more what the West now wants to do over there. Right. Let's see. Anything else on the UK election? So, I guess I'm happy Jeremy Corbyn lost. I'm less optimistic about where the UK is heading or where the world is heading. I still, and I think, as I have said many times, that the real enemy is not the left. I think the left, as the UK election has proved, the left cannot win ultimately. And this, I go back to Leonard Peikoff's DIM. The left is too disintegrated, which 99 genders is reflective of, too disintegrated to win, too disintegrated to capture the common man. And the common man determines the elections. The common man is what ultimately will determine. I mean, the common man is guided by the intellectuals, but there are no intellectuals. So the intellectuals are completely disintegrated. The intellectuals are completely defunct. And therefore the common man is going to go by his instinct, by his emotion, by his cultural conditioning, whatever you want to call it. Unfortunately, he's not taught to think for himself. Somebody asked, why did Corbyn vote hold up so well in London? Because London is where the intellectuals are. London is where the elites, so-called elites are. And where did he win? Corbyn won in the rich parts of London. This again goes to the whole idea that people vote their pocketbook. No, I mean, Corbyn won, socialist won, where the intellectuals live, where the rich people live. That's where they win. Obama won in I forget what it was, in 9 of the 10 richest counties in the United States. Right? It's the common people who vote today for the right. It is the intellectuals who vote for the left. Right? It's New York City who would vote for the left. Even, Elizabeth Warren, I don't know, because Wall Street's so opposed to her, but for much of the left. What we need, what freedom needs, is a new class of intellectuals who can help shape, guide, inspire the common man towards better ideas. But there is none of that. I mean, and what has happened is that the common people, again in England and in, I think, the US, have abandoned the intellectuals, don't want to deal with the intellectuals. And what is left? When the intellectuals represent reason, whether they're reasonable or not, and they're not, what is left is emotion. It's the guts. It's going with your so-called instincts. But it's emotion at the end. And what happens when you abandon reason? I've said this many times. You go with emotion. And how does emotion guide you? Because emotion can't really guide you. So what is the dominant emotion that comes out when you reason is being abandoned? Well, fear. And what is the response to fear? It's huddling up with your tribe, huddling up with people who look like you, huddling up with your class, huddling up with people who seem to have the same pain as you or seem to be as afraid as you. And that leads to want to be protected, and you want to be protected by things that you're afraid of, and it's easy to feed on those fear of the other, fear of, people building stuff in China, because we're not building stuff here anymore, which is one of the great myths of the 21st century. Fear of globalization, it sounds so scary, and then you get labeled a globalist, which is an anti-concept, which means nothing but is scary and really, really bad. Fear is what drives all of this politics. And the response to that is tribalism, collectivism, and an abandonment of markets, because markets require risk-taking. Markets, and I'll do a show on this, right? Markets require certain psychology. Markets, to embrace markets requires self-esteem. It requires saying, I'm willing to put up my talents against anybody in the world. That's what globalization, people who are afraid of globalization are people with no self-esteem. They're cowards. They're not willing to stand up and say, I'm willing to put up my skill against anybody in the world. Nationalism is a cowardly philosophy. It's a philosophy for cowards who are afraid, who are fearful, who fear is what drives them. The Nazis were cowards, motivated by fear. Fear of the other, fear of the unknown, fear of the uncertainty of markets, fear of the uncertainty of a free political system, fearful of those people over there in New York with crazy ideas. And they are crazy ideas. But the only way to combat crazy ideas is with sane ideas, with good ideas. So nationalism and the whole national conservatism is a lack of self-esteem, a lack of confidence, a lack of confidence in your own mind, in your own capacity to think, in your own capacity to deal with the world, to deal with reality, to be successful in reality. It's fundamentally the enemy psychologically of freedom is a lack of self-esteem. And that's what we're seeing all over the world, and certainly what we're seeing in the United States, and I think we're seeing it in the UK. We'll see, again, how it evolves and whether it's any better. All right. If leftist intellectuals are what is preventing the West's move towards capitalism, why aren't these same intellectuals preventing the West's move towards nationalism and racism? Because the leftist intellectuals have discredited themselves. People don't believe in what they're arguing. And So what the leftist intellectuals have created is an intellectual void. And that void could be filled by good intellectuals, pro-free market intellectuals, pro-capitalist intellectuals. But those don't really exist, or there are not enough of them. So this void is filled with fear. This void is filled with emotion. This void is also reinforces people's idea that all intellectuals are bad. So I shouldn't even listen to the free market intellectuals. I shouldn't listen to intellectuals at all. That's too reasonable. And that void is filled with emotion, which leads to tribalism and collectivism and nationalism and all the anti-immigration, anti-trade, anti-otherism that's out there. And that's what leads to the decay of whatever freedom we still have in the West. And I'll talk more about this when I talk about the new alt-right. I don't know if you guys have heard of, oh my God, what's it called? Bronze Age pervert, and who is a big deal these days. We'll talk about him, and we'll talk about Fuentes. Fuentes is small fries as compared to the Bronze Age guy, but we're gonna take them all up. They are powerful forces on the right. Powerful forces on the right, and they are winning. New right or alt-right? Well, I don't know. They're all the same thing. They're all the same thing. There's the collectivistic right. Any chance you would debate Jared Taylor? If I think I know who you mean by Jared Taylor, then the answer is no. I do not debate. I do not debate racists. I will not debate. I will not debate alt-right people, ever. I might accidentally, if I don't know, but if I know somebody, I will not debate them. All right, let's see. Objectivists should enter politics, let their principles known, but act given the context they are presented with and move towards freedom policy by policy. But objectivists can't enter politics because they can't get elected. Now, we'll see how Libby does in Israel. But you can't get elected. What are you going to do in politics if you can't get elected? Who's going to support you? I mean, you people have no concept of how radical we are. I mean, the alt-right's not radical in that sense. The alt-right is this conventional, old-time, nationalistic, racist, xenophobic, same anti-Semitic, same as we've had for thousands of years. There's nothing new there. And the left is the same. They're just Marxists, spun differently, shaped differently, with new, disintegrated ideas. We're a radical shift away from the status quo. This is why I don't like the left-right agenda. We're not on the left-right spectrum at all. We don't resemble any of them. So, we don't have a place in politics yet. What we need are intellectuals. What we need are writers and YouTube personalities and public speakers and professors at universities and writers and writers and writers and writers. You cannot win unless you capture the intellectual high ground. We have to get more intellectuals. That is the number one priority, should be, for the movement. And your job is to help those intellectuals become prominent by supporting their books, by supporting their podcasts, by supporting anything that they do. Get the word out there. Increase the visibility of Ayn Rand, of Leonard Peikoff, and all the intellectuals that are alive today, and are working today, and are producing today. And if you won't do it, nobody will, and we won't go anywhere. But that's all we can do. We will only field politicians that can have an influence, that can actually change the world, once we reach a certain level, certainly in the United States. Now again, in smaller countries, where you can get large amounts of publicity, even if you're in a small minority, it could be different. So I'm not against somebody like Libby going into politics in Israel, because she can have a huge impact in Israel. She will be interviewed by all the top TV stations. She will get features in the newspaper. She will get her point of view out there. So doing politics in a small country like Israel and a relatively intellectual country like Israel can be very powerful as a marketing technique. But in the United States, you don't have a chance. Not yet. Now, we could do this in small countries. I think other small countries. I mean, I think Georgia. I talked about Georgia and how much I like Georgia. I think you could do a lot in Georgia because it's a small country, and I think you'd get a voice. And the free market people there are doing a lot, and an objectivist should run in Georgia. Somebody's asking that I should do talks in Scotland. I'm going to be in Scotland. I'm giving a talk at Edinburgh University of Edinburgh, one of the two, in January. Somebody asked, have you read any of the Q Post? I haven't. I've not read any of the Q Post. These weird things like, who would have ever thought of reading something called Q Post? I don't know. Put up a link. Tell me what Q Post is. I'm writing it down. Q Post. Okay. So I will be in Edinburgh in February 10th or 11th. It's on my website, yaronbrookshow.com. All right. We spent an hour on this. So I want to talk about, I don't know if I should do this now. Oh, God. This is a big topic. I want to talk about Trump's executive order on anti-Semitism. And there's a lot to say about it. And it's, again, never easy. All right, let's do it. And I'll do it relatively fast, and we'll have to come back to the topic. So let's start with a fact. A fact. The anti-Semitism is on the rise in the United States, in Europe. It is significant. It is, we saw the shooting just a few days ago in New Jersey. We saw the shooting at synagogues both in California and I forget the other states where synagogues were shot at. We saw with Jeremy Corbyn, if you track the kind of anti-Semitism that exists in the Labour Party among Jeremy Corbyn fans, it's just unbelievable. We see it everywhere. We see it on the left. We see it on the right. We see it on the left fringe, on the right fringe. We see it everywhere, right? And it's definitely in the rise. I saw it when I talked about the alt-right. You see it on my chat on YouTube. Anytime I talk about anything, they show up, and the hatred of Jews, the Jewish. It's just amazing. If you follow Nick Fuentes, who is this new character on the alt-right, the anti-Semitism just reeks out of him. I mean, he does whole shows that are basically just condemnation of Jews for doing this or for doing that. If you see what the Goipers, when they go and attack some of the speakers, and Charlie Cook, and even Donald Trump's son, and Ben Shapiro, again, the anti-Semitism reeks out of what they have to say. So anti-Semitism is everywhere. It's getting worse, and it's getting significantly violent. Again, both on the left and the right, mostly on the right, but also on the left. The number of violent incidents of anti-Semitism are really way up all over the place. New York, London, it is a real challenge, and it's really scary, right? So, and it's consistent, by the way, consistent with the story I told before. That is, when people are afraid, when people are focused on emotion, not on reason, when the orientation is to distrust and to fear the other, then history has suggested that the most convenient other to go after are the Jews. And that the most dangerous others for many of these groups because they look like them. So there's a whole debate, both in the intersectionality community and in the alt-right community, about whether Jews are white. To them, it's really important, right? So in the intersectionality community, they're white, but they're Jewish. So they're not quite as oppressive as being white and non-Jewish. So they're a little bit oppressed, so they get some points for being Jewish. But they're still oppressors because they're dominantly white. But in the alt-right community, and notice there's not a big difference between the intersectionalists and the alt-right, they're all the same. On the right, Jews are not white. They're kind of sneakily white. They're dangerous white because they look like whites, but they're really Jews. They're the devil within their community that can't be differentiated. So they particularly hate the Jews. But this is what happens when you abandon reason and individualism. Historically, for 2,000 years, you go after the Jews. It always happens. Now, amazingly, when I came to the United States in the 80s, I thought anti-Semitism in America was dead, would never come back. I didn't think that. I thought it was always a danger, but it was way in the distant future. Right. And now I see it here. And I don't think it's in the distant future. I really do see it here. Again, both on the alt-left and alt-right. And it's scary. Somebody asked, has anti-Semitism ever been as bad as it is now in this country's history? I think probably the answer is yes. I think probably, certainly overt anti-Semitism was much, much worse. You see Ken expressing this anti-Semitic views on my chat, right? Jews are a big gang. Really? Where's my gang? I don't have a big gang. To the extent that I'm Jewish, where's my gang? I don't have one. But that's typical. That's kind of the irrationality, the focus on emotion, and the fear. What motivates anti-Semites, people like Ken, more than anything else, is fear. And the way it expresses it is fear of the other, fear of the Jew. And you shouldn't make light of this. I know a lot of people make light of the alt-right. Oh, they're just having fun. No, this isn't fun. This is evil. It has to be crushed intellectually. It has to be opposed. You shouldn't sanction it. You shouldn't laugh at it. You should identify it and declare it as the indespicable garbage that it is. Well, somebody says he's a troll, I should ignore him. But he represents something, and it's something that I'm talking about. So why not use him as an example? And there are lots of them. And the fact that somebody trolls anti-Semitic language and say, oh, it's just trolling, well, that doesn't excuse it. I don't get this. Oh, trolling, we're just having fun with swastikas. No. Trolling has to be taken seriously, at face value, because it represents something real. Anyway, so I think explicit anti-Semitism was probably worse in the early 20th century in America, where Jews were not allowed to certain clubs, where Harvard clearly discriminated against Jews, and Harvard, Yale, all the Ivy Leagues discriminated against Jews. So it used to be much more explicit and part of the culture. In a sense now, it's at the fringes. Used to be part of the mainstream. Part of the mainstream. So anti-Semitism is a real issue, just like I think racism is a real issue, and both are on the rise, I think, in America today. So it would be nice to have the President of the United States use a platform to denounce racism and anti-Semitism and everything they represent. And, the executive order, to some extent, does that. But it does a lot more than that. Now, what does the executive order do? It basically applies Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin in programs and activities receiving federal financial assistance. Now, you can see here that this is a big problem. By the way, somebody's asking if I'm Jewish. I like Ayn Rand's answer to that. I'm Jewish only in the face of anti-Semitism. I don't know what it means to be Jewish otherwise, to me, right? I'm not part of a Jewish race because there is no such thing. I have a certain affinity to some aspects of Jewish culture because I grew up with it, but I don't view myself as culturally Jewish. I don't hang out with Jews and sing Jewish songs and do stuff like that. So, no, I don't consider myself. I consider myself an objectivist ideologically and an American from a national perspective, from a place I live, from a place that I admire and respect and want to live in. But, all right. So this is the problem. The problem is once the government starts giving money to entities, organizations, then it wants to be engaged in determining how those organizations function. And the Civil Rights Act is a government intervention into private organizations like universities, private universities, because that university gets federal financial assistance. Now, this is bound to create massive problems. There's no way to solve these problems. It's wrong for the government to be interfering. It's wrong for the government to get involved in what private businesses do in their own space. But if they fund those programs, then it's an extension of the government. But since they fund everything today, almost, they subsidize businesses, they subsidize universities, they subsidize schools, even private universities. Then does that mean everything is an extension of our government and therefore the government can impose its will on everybody? That is very, very dangerous territory. And the whole use of Title VI, Title VII, Title IX, or the different aspects of civil rights, anti-discrimination in sports among female and male athletes, and all this stuff has just corrupted our institutions. It's corrupted our institutions. Instead of institutions determining their own policies around these things, and let, in a sense, us, the market, determine who you're willing to deal with and who is not, the government now dictates to them how they should and shouldn't behave. Right? So I think the whole Title VI is problematic. But fundamental to that problematic is the fact that the government even gives anybody any money. In order to do this, you have to eliminate, in order to get to any kind of ideal, you have to eliminate government financial assistance to businesses, to universities, particularly private universities. This is why I don't like school vouchers, because it's the government handing money to particular schools identified by the government, and therefore the government now says, we give you financial assistance, so we have to regulate you. Tax credits are much better, where they don't get involved in identifying which schools can get the voucher and which don't. So whenever government intervenes, it's problematic. Now, the Civil Rights Act says you cannot discriminate based on race, color, and national origin. And this is a problem for if you want to combat anti-Semitism, because Jews are not a race, they're not a color, and they're not a national origin. And they don't want to be a national origin. I mean, Jews in America consider themselves Americans. And they're certainly not a race. Now, they're a religion, but the Civil Rights Act doesn't actually say you cannot discriminate based on religion. Because, why is that? Well, because certain universities want to be able to discriminate based on religion, particularly religious universities. So if they couldn't discriminate based on religion, that would be a problem for them. So they've excluded religion from Title VI. And Jews are a religion, but they're not a religion. Jews are not even a religion, really. Many American Jews who identify themselves as Jewish are, atheists. So what is it to be Jewish? Well, even Jews don't know exactly what it is to be Jewish. It's it's your heritage. It's cultural to some extent. Maybe it's religious. But it's not race, color, or national origin. So Trump, in applying Title VI to Jews, to anti-Semitism, is struggling here with how to make it fit into the definition of the Civil Rights Act, which is a bad act in this sense. Other things are very good in the Civil Rights Act, where it walks away from Jim Crow laws, where it makes sure that government cannot discriminate. So it says in the executive order, it says, while Title VI does not cover discrimination based on religion, individuals who face discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin do not lose protection under Title VI for also being a member of a group that shares common religious practices. I don't know what that means. Discrimination against Jews may give rise to Title VI violation when the discrimination is based on an individual's race, color, or national origin. So if the discriminator views the Jews as a race or views the Jews as a nation, then you can apply Title VI to it. And he says, it shall be the policy of the executive branch to enforce Title VI against prohibited forms of discrimination rooted in anti-Semitism as vigorously as against all other forms of discrimination prohibited by Title VI. Now, by the way, all of this is consistent with policy that was already being implemented by the Bush administration and by the Obama administration around anti-Semitism, but also in their cases around anti-Islam and anti-other religion, where they rope religion somehow into the Title VI Civil Rights Act. Certain religions, right? Now, the next question is, well, how do you define anti-Semitism? Well, here they're using this very vague definition by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is an alliance that tries to offend nobody in defining what anti-Semitism is. Right? And they write, anti-Semitism is a sudden perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. What does that mean? A sudden perception which may be completely non-objective. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, towards Jewish community, institutions, and religious rights. So here, it's rhetorical, physical manifestations. But what is of anti-Semitism? But what does anti-Semitism actually mean? Well, it's the same as racism. What does racism mean? It means treating people based on their race, positively or negatively. Anti-Semitism means treating Jews differently based on the fact that they're Jews or not Jews. That's what anti-Semitism means. Now, the left has a problem because, they have defined racism to mean, only whites can be racist. If you're oppressed, you cannot be a racist. So blacks can't be racist. Now, it's interesting whether blacks can be anti-Semitic. And there's a huge problem because I guess the shooters in New Jersey were part of these black Israelites. But the left, the intersectionality left, can't define blacks as anti-Semites because blacks are more oppressed in the hierarchy of oppression than Jews are, and therefore you can't be anti-somebody upwards. You can only be downwards. You're inherently oppressive by being at the top. Right? So, they can't define anti-Semitism. They don't know what it exactly is. Both left and right struggle with this. They don't want to define it clearly because they're worried about offending some constituency. And then what does Title VI actually say? I mean, you can say I hate Jews at a university. I mean, that's protected speech. You can't. So what it really implies is if I punch you and say I hate you, then that's a normal crime, assault. If I punch you and I shout at you, I hate Jews, then it's a hate crime assault. But the whole concept of hate crimes is an illegitimate concept. Coming out of this kind of, I think, Title VI. Or the government can withhold supports on departments that they believe are expressing anti-Semitic views, even though those views would be protected under the First Amendment in terms of their expression. So it's difficult to know what exactly the implication here, but one of the things that is clear is that this is targeted at a particular type of anti-Semitism. And this is where Jews as a nation fits it, and this is where Donald Trump's attempt over the last few years to identify Jews as a nation, Jews as nationalists affiliated with Israel, not the United States. Trump does this constantly, talking about Israel as the country of American Jews. Jews in America should support Donald Trump because he supports their country, Israel. And creating this idea, which many Jews on the left hate, that their country is not America, that their country is Israel, which feeds into the whole alt-right rhetoric. The rhetoric I'm accused of, often not just by alt-right, by all kinds of things, of having split alliances. How many times have we seen on my stream people accusing me of being not American, but being Israeli, being pro-Israel, more than pro-American, not really caring about America. But Trump is feeding into that, often in his rhetoric, constantly in his rhetoric. And what this executive order is really targeted at is the anti-Israel movement on campuses. That's what it's really targeted at. Now, it's true that much of the anti-Israel movement on campuses is motivated by anti-Semitism, but not all of it. You can be anti-Israel without being anti-Semitic. Now, just in case you might think that I'm making this up, that it's not in the executive order, well, the guy behind the executive order is Jared Kushner, who's Jewish, who's the son-in-law of Donald Trump. He actually has been pushing for the executive order for a long time. He wrote an op-ed in the New York Times explaining what the executive order was supposed to do. And it's clear in his thing that, to him, he says, anti-Semitic incidents have been rising in the United States since 2013. Students in particular continue to face anti-Semitic harassment in schools and on college campuses. All true. And then he says the problem is Title IV of the Civil Rights Act discriminates only based on race, color, or national origin. But it should also help with discrimination against Jews, right? And he talks about, so here's some examples of how this would apply, he says. The alliance defines, he says, the targeting of the state of Israel, conceived as a Jewish collectivity, and those who deny the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming that the existence of Israel is a racist endeavor, or those who compare the contemporary Israel policy to that of the Nazis as examples of anti-Semitism. And he says later on, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Now that's just not true. Now, it often is. I'm not saying it isn't always. It often is. But sometimes anti-Zionism is just anti-Zionism. Sometimes it's mistaken, it's confused, or sometimes it's just anti-nationalism. And there are moments where I'm anti-Zionist. Because I don't believe in the ideal there would be a Jewish state. I'm not a Zionist in that sense. The ideal is not to have a Jewish state. Not to have any kind of ethnic-based, religion-based state. I've said this often. You should listen to my talk on the rise and fall of the State of Israel. There's a real problem with Zionism. Right? So, it's not always true. Now, it's true today that most anti-Zionists are anti-Semites. But okay, but now we're going to outlaw anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And what is the manifestation of this? And again, it should be all protected speech. You're allowed to be a bigot if we believe in the First Amendment. So what exactly is the government going to ban? What exactly is the administration going to do? I mean, Jared says this administration's commitment to open debate and the pursuit of truth on our nation's campuses is unwavering. In enforcing Title VI against the wider spectrum of prohibited discrimination, government agencies will continue to respect the free flow of ideas, even those that are detestable, and enforce critical protections for free speech and political debate. But we will stand firmly against using taxpayer resources to entrench and subsidize invidious discrimination. Now, all of that is fine, but it's unworkable as long as you are actually engaged in subsidizing the universities. Because who is to say what is invidious discrimination? The government? The government must stay out of these decisions, must stay out of it completely. I'm against Title VI because I'm against government interference in private enterprise, and I'm against government involvement in ideas, and I'm for the separation not only of church and state, but of ideas from state. I don't want the government starting to tell us what are good ideas and bad ideas, discriminatory ideas, non-discriminatory ideas, racist ideas, not racist ideas, anti-Semitic ideas, not anti-Semitic ideas, Zionist ideas, not anti-Zionist ideas. Stay out of it. Now, if in order to stay out of it, you need to stop giving money to universities, then all the better. I'm for that. All right. So that is my position on this. Let's do three quick questions, and then we'll call it a day. What do you think of the vile BDS that targets Israeli products with boycotts, just like in Nazi Germany where Jude was displayed in storefronts? I think it's vile. I think it's horrible. I think it's pathetic. Really disgusting. I think most of it is motivated by anti-Semitism, but a lot of it's just leftist, objection to Israeli assertiveness, leftist to so-called Jewish colonialism, right? It doesn't have to be anti-Semitic. It doesn't have to be hatred of Jews for being Jews. It can be hatred of Israel for being what it is and doing what it is. It's wrong in all cases. BDS is an evil movement, completely. But it's not always motivated by anti-Semitism. But I think BDS is just horrific, always. Because I think Israel's a good country, fundamentally. Capitalist Nick also asked, can you be anti-Zionist and not be anti-Semitic? Yeah, I think there are lots of anti-Zionists who are not anti. I know a lot of Jews who are anti-Zionist. I've got an uncle who's an anti-Zionist, but I wouldn't call him anti-Semitic. They just think the Zionist project is a wrong project. They think the Jews should have stayed in Europe, or that the Jews should not be oppressing, quote, the Palestinians, or lots of things. I mean, they're wrong. They're evil. It's completely corrupt. But don't lump all corruptness into one label, right? You can be an anti-Zionist, evil monstrosity without being anti-Semitic. Do you think Sanders' legacy will be to give younger generations of vile anti-Semites like Linda Sarsour and AOC platforms to legitimize their views? Well, I don't think that's Sanders' legacy. I think that's the legacy of the modern left. And I think Sanders is not the creator of the phenomena. He's just an exploiter of the phenomena. In many respects, I think this is the legacy of leftist intellectuals. Again, I don't think politicians are ever the primary. I think this is the legacy of leftist, Marxist, nihilist intellectuals of the last 50 years. And it's also a legacy, and I haven't talked about this enough, but I will talk about this when I talk about the alt-right. It's a legacy of the conservative movement, because the conservative movement has failed. I mean, one of the things that's unequivocal now, and the conservatives know it, and it's you should see the debates about this among conservatives. The conservative movement has failed. The William F. Buckley coalition has been a disaster long term. And part of the consequence of the failure of the conservative movement is the rise of the nutty left. And this is part of that rejection. Paul asked, what is Zionism? Zionism is the idea that Israel is the home of the Jewish people, and that the Jews should establish a state in Israel and for a state for Jews, right? For Jews. And I've said I support that in the short run. I don't support it as an ideal. I don't support it as what an ideal should be in the long run. I think it's the only short run solution to anti-Semitism, which is everywhere around us. But long term, it's incompatible with individualism, and therefore has to go away. Zionism cannot and will not survive the rise of individualism. All right, a question completely off topic. I'll take it because it was asked before I said no more Super Chat questions. You told me that the Fed buying small amounts of government debt to get rid of the federal debt won't work. They seem to be doing just that. How long before the market figures it out? I don't even know what you mean. They're not getting rid of the federal debt. The federal debt continues. That is, it doesn't change the fact that the Fed has always bought government debt. It's the way at which it infuses money into the economy. But it doesn't get rid of the debt. The government actually pays the Fed interest on that debt. And it actually pays it the principal when the debt expires. Now, it's true that the profits the Fed makes, it returns to the Treasury. But the Treasury, when listing debt, the amount of debt held by the Fed is still held by the Fed. It's still listed as debt. It doesn't disappear. They don't burn the bonds. The bonds are actually paid off. Now, what would happen if the Fed bought large amounts of government debt, which they did, by the way, in QE2, in QE1, 2, and 3. They bought large amounts of government debt, and they bought, even worse, mortgage-backed securities. And, one of these days, again, I'll do a whole show on that. That is very destructive to the economy. That creates money into the economy in ways that distort the rate of interest. They distort inflation. They distort the economy, because it is an arbitrary funneling of money into the economy in arbitrary ways. But that's a whole other discussion elsewhere. So it doesn't get rid of the debt. It just changes where it's held. Instead of it held in my balance sheet, it's held on the Fed's balance sheet. It's still there, though. All right. That is it for today. I will see you all maybe tomorrow. I think I'm doing a show with Amy on Tuesday. Maybe we'll do tomorrow. I've got a bunch of shows that I am thinking about trying to prepare. I think this buying the QE stuff is going to be a topic one of these days. But I'm thinking about this next show about the alt-right. I'm reading up a lot of stuff about national conservatism and all of that. There's a lot going on right now, a lot being written, and it's hard for me to keep up with everything that's being written. but I'm trying to read all the stuff so that I can present it to you. So so you can thank me later for not having to read it, because it's very, very, very upsetting stuff. Yeah, I can tell you now, Q is not legit on the chat. All right, we will talk soon. Thanks, everybody. Have a great little bit of a weekend left, and I will talk to you next week. Bye, everybody.